The last philosopher we're looking at this semester is David Hume. Now, I didn't assign you any of Hume's epistemological works this semester. We're going to be reading a very nice short piece called Dialogues on Natural Religion. However, I did want to take a few minutes to talk about a couple of important points out of Hume's epistemology. You'll see this reflected to some extent in the dialogues, even if he doesn't give a systematic account of any of these things. As you know, Hume is, like Locke and like Berkeley, an empiricist. So his beginning assumption is that the mind gathers information, it gathers ideas through the senses. This continual flow of stimuli through the senses is the source of all of the content of our minds, and then the mind's able to do certain things with this: compare, contrast, relate, join together, separate these ideas, and it's out of this that we construct then what we call knowledge. Now, the rationalist philosophers, as you recall, had a very different idea about the source of knowledge. They wanted to argue that we have certain ideas that are just part of the fabric of our mind. They're innate, they're a priori. They're in the mind, they don't rest on any experience at all. And through analysis and understanding of these ideas, we can derive all of human knowledge. Some of the rationalists had very optimistic views about what in the future would ultimately be possible, what we might be able to derive in the same way that we do mathematics, with a priori proofs that don't ultimately rely upon any sensory experience whatsoever. So we saw that for the rationalists this resulted in the rather extravagant claim that nearly any question about the world outside of us that we might wish to understand, we would be able to have something like a mathematical proof to settle it. And you'll recall that Locke introduced this idea of critique. In fact, this was one of the reasons that he gives for wanting to write his essay concerning human understanding, is to be able to say something systematic about what we can know and what we can't know. It's not going to be possible for us to know everything. Can we in fact understand and define the limits of knowledge? It seemed that Locke and that Berkeley, even though they thought our knowledge was limited by ideas that we get through the senses and by what the mind is capable of doing with those ideas, it seemed that they thought we could know quite a few things, nevertheless. Some of their conclusions about what we can know on this basis seemed to be rightly surprising and left you wondering if indeed they really had the justification for those knowledge claims. We saw in Berkeley's dialogues that this term skepticism was kind of a dirty word. The skeptic to Hylas and Philonous was someone who denies the reality of things, and that this is an arcane theoretical philosophical principle that is offensive to healthy common sense of the average, ordinary, non-philosophical human being. Hume, in fact, embraces the title of skeptic, although it may perhaps mean something slightly different than it does for Berkeley's characters, Hylas and Philonous. The skeptic is someone who doubts, who raises doubts about the possibilities of knowledge, about what we can know and can't know. And indeed, it's kind of an extension of that Lockean notion of critique, of defining the limits of knowledge. Hume, much more consistently than Locke, thinks through to conclusions what the implications are of the assumptions about the source of our knowledge. And so we see in Hume's epistemology quite a contrast to the rationalists, whereas the rationalist starting point, their assumptions about the source of our knowledge and what we could do with that led to the conclusion that we could know virtually anything simply by the force of a reason alone, Hume, thinking things through from the empiricist starting point, comes to the conclusion that we can know virtually nothing. I mean, of course we can know the contents of our minds at the present moment, what we're thinking at any one time, what appears to us, the phenomena that are before our minds at any given moment. We can maybe dismiss concerns about whether those things that we perceive actually exist as we perceive them independently of our perceptions of them. But beyond that, we see that we make all kinds of knowledge claims which are in fact embodied and typified by the modern natural sciences, by our understanding of the laws of nature, which gives us some understanding of how nature works. At least we understand the phenomena, which allows us also to make predictions. Okay? Those predictions allow us to be able to engineer all kinds of machines and other devices that may be useful to us, and to do this reliably, and to build up, a whole experiential based understanding of nature and the workings of nature that can be put to our service. What can we, however, really know if our starting point is the empiricist principles? And this is what Hume attacks when he examines causality, because all of our formulations of what we call laws of nature are basically causal laws, and it's those causal laws that we can use to predict things. So let's take an example, okay, in Hume's spirit, in his analysis of causality. Suppose we see an event in which we see where we're assigned one thing a cause and the other event the effect. Let's say we have a ball that has been set in motion. It's rolling towards another ball that is at rest, okay? And then it strikes that ball and causes the other ball to move. So Hume asks, what do we actually perceive in this? What can we trace back to those simple ideas that come to us through the senses, and the more complex ideas and relations that we put together out of those simple ideas? I see one ball in motion. I see it approaching the second ball that's at rest. I see them come into contact. Perhaps I hear a noise when they contact. Then I see the second ball begin to move. Where do I see a cause? The idea of a cause and effect, according to Hume, is the idea of a necessary connection. We think of a cause, okay, especially an effect relationship, okay, one such as is formulated by what we think are the laws of nature, as something that has to happen. There's a necessary connection between that cause and the effect. So that if the cause happens, if the cause occurs, and there's nothing else to interfere, right, nobody sticks their hand in to stop the ball, then the effect must occur. Okay? There's a necessary connection between the one and the other. But Locke asks, okay, what is this idea of necessary connection? Where does it come from? Okay? Can I trace the idea of a necessary connection back to any simple ideas, anything that I see or hear or taste or smell or feel? Okay? There is nothing there for a necessary connection. And we can demonstrate this by the fact that the effect of that cause is in no way in our minds necessitated. We can imagine all kinds of other things happening. When the first ball strikes the second ball, we expect it to move. But I could imagine all kinds of other things happening. I could imagine the first ball striking the second ball disappearing, or exploding, or sprouting wings and flying away, or a multitude of other possible events different from the expected effect. So what are our grounds for attributing to this attributing this to some sort of a necessary connection that is nowhere to be gained from any of our perceptions. Where does that come from? What does it rest on? Well, according to Hume, it seems to rest upon this expectation that we have that the future is going to resemble the past. Suppose I hold an object, okay, up in the air, pick up a pebble, and I release it. What do I expect to happen? I expect it to fall to the ground. And I have a law of gravity to explain that, okay, and to explain the rate of acceleration at which it falls to the ground. And when I release that pebble, indeed it falls to the ground. What governs my expectation that it's going to fall to the ground? Okay, well, not really that, I've read about gravity. What governs that expectation is my expectation that the future is going to resemble the past, and every time I have done something similar to the past, that's exactly what's happened. Does it have to happen? I could imagine all kinds of other things happening as well. I could imagine the pebble just floating there in space. There's no logical contradiction to that happening. So my only grounds for thinking that it really is going to fall is the fact that I expect the future to resemble the past. Well, what are my grounds for this claim that the future is going to resemble the past? Only that it always has in the past. So there are in fact no rational grounds, okay, for us to claim that there are causal laws, that there are necessary connections between cause and effect, or that the future in nature is inevitably going to resemble the past. Okay. We expect it to be like that, and it's perhaps important that we expect it to be like that. How do I know, what will happen when I open the door and step outside? Okay. Will the walkway support me? Will it fall apart and dump me into a chasm? Will it turn into a fire-breathing dragon? Okay. Any of those things I can imagine. There's nothing contradictory about those notions to prevent me from seeing that as a possibility. The fact that it's been safe to step outside the door in the past is no guarantee that it will be in the future, but I fully expect it to. And it's important that I expect it to, because if I didn't, then obviously that would make life somewhat difficult. So, but what are the grounds for this? According to Hume, it's simply habit. Okay, we are creatures of habit. We just happen to be that way. We can't say why we find ourselves that way. There's a force of nature that inclines us to think like that. But do we have any rational grounds, any real justification for saying that we know that the world is like that? In fact, we don't. So all of these things that we think we know, okay, all of these things in terms of general claims about nature, natural laws, Hume's not saying that we should stop doing that or that we could stop doing that, but to say that this is actually matters of knowledge, things that we think we can know, okay, this goes beyond what we are actually justified in saying. In fact, okay, and this is Hume's skepticism, in fact, what we are really justified in saying we know is very, very little. So from the rationalist claim that leads to the notion that we can know virtually everything that there is to be known, okay, in principle, and that we can do that by means of some sort of rational calculation, like Leibniz's universal calculus, that will allow us to calculate not just the area under a curve, but the answers to any question whatsoever that we might conceivably pose. Okay. We come to the other extreme with Hume's skepticism. When we analyze our sources of our so-called knowledge, what do we find that we really actually know? very little, next to nothing.